Hi, it's Scott Vogel on sex addiction, and I'm going to answer the question often asked, how can I recover from sex addiction? If you're struggling with sex addiction, you probably know how difficult it can be to even take the first steps toward admitting that you have a problem and asking for help, and that's the first step towards recovery. The roller coaster of emotions that you're likely experiencing or have been experiencing may make the prospect of recovery seem hopeless and impossible. It's normal that you feel this way. A lot of people struggling with sex addiction feel this way. The good news is that you are taking the first step because you're thinking about recovery. You're reading this, or you're reading this for someone else. You've taken the first step towards seeking help, which is learning how you can recover from your sexual addiction. Let's start the conversation with treatment programs. Inpatient treatment is perhaps the most effective way to battle a sex addiction. It's inpatient. It allows you to go to a facility and take care of your addiction and the underlying trauma surrounding your addiction. You'd be surrounded by trained professionals in helping those struggling with sex addiction. And it's a comprehensive approach they take so that they're treating everything. They're treating all aspects of the addiction. They're treating all the behaviors. They're not just treating the actual sex addiction, but what's behind it. It allows you to gain distance from your addiction, from the places, the people, the things, the triggers that are causing you so much trouble. And it allows you to separate from your life for a while. And it takes less time to recover from your addiction when you go to an inpatient treatment facility. You see, recovery from sex addiction, it takes a while. It's not just an activity, it's a process. And it takes time. It took you a long time probably to get where you are. But with the right amount of support and recovery and therapy, it is possible to recover from a sex addiction. There's a lot of emotional work that needs to be done because sex addiction is based a lot on what's happened in a person's life. So when we deal with the emotions, we start to come out with trauma work, the traumas of the past, of things that may have happened. There may have been abuse, there may have been neglect, abandonment, enmeshment, different issues in life that cause some trauma. And trauma doesn't have to be this huge thing where there's this huge event. Trauma can be a series of little things beginning with childhood, with conception, with the early years of being traumatized by not having a life properly mirrored and modeled for the addict. It takes specialized care when you're dealing with sex addiction, and trained therapists like a CSAT, a certified sex addiction therapist, or somebody that's trained in the field of addiction to help the person deal with the shame and the guilt. There's so much guilt and shame involved in sex addiction. Sex in itself is a difficult topic to deal with, but add the fact of an addiction. We're still back in the dark ages with sex addiction, almost where alcoholism was in the 30s before it became a disease, a recognized disease. And same with drugs before it became a recognized disease. So there's a lot of that guilt and shame that people need to overcome in getting into recovery. There are medications that are often used in conjunction with all this treatment in order to treat some of the underlying problems, which could be anxiety, which could be depression and sadness and bipolar disorder, which is why it's important to get to psychiatrists and certified therapists that understand what you're going through, what you're experiencing, so that you have a better chance of treating all of the underlying symptoms of the disease. Next, we'll talk about cognitive behavior therapy. Cognitive behavior therapy will help you or a sex addict to understand the triggers that are relative to their addictive behaviors. You see, over time, the addict learns what their behaviors are. And they'll learn to identify their triggers and then effective ways of managing them. One of the most effective ways of preventing relapse into sexually compulsive behaviors is for a sex addict to find another physical activity, such as cardiovascular, exercise, or cycling, or running, or a hobby, or something to do. So cognitive, being cognizant of the behavior and then changing it is where the cognitive behavior therapy comes in. Now, interpersonal therapy it's quite common and it's really easy to understand. Simply put, interpersonal therapy is talk therapy. It's the act of talking through problems and emotions. And this allows a sex addict much more self-control and the ability to deal with their emotions when they start to practice and learn what it is to talk about their feelings, to talk about their emotions, to talk about their problems, to talk about anything in their life. And a good therapist will allow that person to do it. And group therapy is a very effective method because when you go to a group and you get therapy that way, you realize that you're not alone and that you're not unique in your addiction. Believe it or not, you're not the only one struggling with this addiction. There's hundreds, thousands, and millions of people struggling. You might say, well, they don't do what I do. Well, yes, believe it or not, there are many people out there, no matter how dark, no matter how deep, no matter how sad you are or perverted you might think your behaviors are. There's many other people out there that are struggling with the same shame and guilt and hopelessness. There is hope in recovery. Getting into a 12-step program is vital to support a sex addict. It's just very important because 12-step meetings become part of the overall recovery with therapy, with interpersonal therapy, with working with a therapist. The meetings basically fulfill the need to belong to a group of people. There's SA, which is Sexaholics Anonymous. There's SAA, which is Sex Addicts Anonymous. And there's SLAA, which is Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. Do some research online and see which of those three might be helpful to you. That's a really good first step to take, is to go attend at least 6 12-step meetings and realize that you may not like one meeting, you may like another. You may not like what people are saying in a meeting. There's a saying that goes very well for newly recovering addicts. When you go to a meeting, take what you want and leave the rest. If there's one little nugget of information in a whole meeting that might help you stay sober and get into recovery, focus on that, not the other things or the other people or the other personalities. 12-step programs work to get into recovery along with group therapy, interpersonal therapy, individual therapy, and for those that can afford it, intensive, inpatient treatment for the recovery from sex addiction. Recovery is possible. This is Scott Vogel on sex addiction. Please visit our YouTube channel on sex addiction for more videos on sex addiction and recovery from sex addiction. Go to www.onsexaddiction.com for a free video explaining what sex addiction is, 7 symptoms of sex addiction, the 4 traumas of sex addiction, the 4 faulty core beliefs set up by those traumas of addiction, and the solution, the 7 paths to success in recovery from sex addiction. You'll also find more information, articles, and videos about sex addiction and sex addiction recovery. This is Scott Vogel on sex addiction.